Welcome to Finds of Yesterday. Are jewelry pieces with lobster claw clasps vintage or not? This is not a simple yes or no answer. Since I started reselling jewelry on eBay, I have always had this question about lobster claw clasps. Throughout this time frame, I've seen several discussions whether lobster claw clasps were vintage or not. One thing that may play a role in this is the actual definition of vintage. It gets hard to date some pieces of jewelry when they have a lobster claw clasp, so I dug a little deeper in research to determine that answer. Some of the conclusions I came up with may be my determination from all the factors that I found, and maybe my opinion. So in this video, we're going to cover the definitions and patents and try to solve this mystery. So what is the definition of vintage? In my research, I found that a majority of people consider vintage at least 20 years old to 100 years old. So right now, that would be between 2004 or earlier. It's just easier to say anything in the 1920s to 2000 or pre-2000, in my opinion. Some people consider it 50 years old to 100 years old. Once it reaches 100 years old, it becomes an antique. So the definition from the Oxford Dictionary mostly refers to wine, but it also is saying that the time that something of quality was produced, which certainly refers to jewelry items back in the day. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary says a dating from the past, old. And yet another one says it means of age. Some antique dealers that I know consider vintage at least 40 years old to be, so between the age of 1924 to 1984. Other dealers believe it should be 50 to 100 years old. So there's a wide range of opinions on the term vintage. This term vintage has an open-ended meaning. Many eBayers consider vintage to be at least 20 years old, and Etsy requires vintage items to be at least 20 years old to list on their platform as well. So for this discussion, we're just going to go with 20 years old, and this is what I go by in my reselling business. So in many of my past videos, I say this necklace has a lobster claw clasp, so it is not vintage. I need to clarify this in detail, so you know what I'm referring to. Let's start with the evolution of the lobster claw clasp. Back in 1954, Albert Nielsen filed for a patent for this type of jewelry clasp, which looks somewhat like a claw when open. This was the closest I could find to a lobster claw. You have to pull back on the little hook on the top to open it. It was approved in 1959, so that's when you'll start seeing this type of clasp on jewelry. It has it's kind of a cross between a fold-over clasp and a lobster claw. Honestly, I hardly ever see this type of clasp. And there are a couple variations throughout the next couple decades. In the 1950s, Cartier started using a clasp that's similar to the lobster claw. So you may start seeing this type of clasp in the US around that time frame, but the Cartier logo is stamped on it as you see here, so it's easy to distinguish. In the 1960s, Italian gold jewelry was becoming imported and becoming popular in the US, and you'll start seeing this rectangular elongated version of the clasp from Italy. Wilson Estate Jewelry shows an 18-karat gold necklace from the 1960s with a lobster claw clasp. It's most likely Italian. Since these clasps were being made in other countries, there is certainly a good possibility that they were shipped to the US, and you'll start seeing them in the jewelry making process back then. This clasp here was from the 1970s, and it's another variation. It's kind of more of a wiry, thinner type clasp. It was probably not as popular and probably used more on keychains. Then in 1974, Monet Jewelers filed for a patent and was approved in 1976. This one is easy to distinguish because it has the Monet on the sides of it. It is kind of a teardrop or egg shape with a little knob on the side, and it splits open on the top when you depress the knob. It looks like a claw. In 1976, this style clasp mechanism was patented. It operates like a scissors-like manner. It has more of a section that you push into the body of the clasp and forces the lock knob to open like a scissors. So throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you will see many variations of the lobster claw clasp. They will be sporadic, and you may see gold ones. They're most likely Italian. Others may be from other countries or from high-end designers like Cartier. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and didn't see this style until later, and if I did, it was very few. I didn't have much gold or high-end jewelry back then, so throughout my research online, looking at these pieces that are for sale, I did run across a couple necklaces that looked vintage and had more of a modern lobster claw clasp on them. There could be a couple different reasons for this. The old one was lost, broken, damaged, and they replaced it with a more modern lobster claw clasp. Or it could be from another country or a high-end designer. Finally, we reach the modern-day clasp. It wasn't until 1996 that the modern lobster claw clasp was invented and patented in the US. This is the one that I almost always am referring to when I say it has a modern day lobster claw clasp in my videos. You see these everywhere nowadays, but we must look at the piece as a whole. Here is the patent with the timestamp of December 24th, 1996, up on the top, almost 1997. I checked through all of the similar clasp patents and did not find one earlier than this. This patent is from a Japanese inventor filed here in the US on December 14, 1994. He has referenced many of the past inventions and that we discussed here and most similar ones that I could find. I have over 4,000 jewelry items in my store and don't recall but a couple times questioning whether or not an item was vintage when it had a lobster claw clasp, but after doing more research I did discover that there is a possibility of running across a lobster claw clasp that is vintage from the 1950s onward. As you've seen, Cartier made their own Italian ones, started showing up, coming into the US, and there are a couple variations of the lobster claw clasp that was slowly infiltrating the jewelry market. How often do we come across those? Not very often. It wasn't until this modern day one was patented in 1996 that we started seeing them consistently here in the US. Then this straight elongated clasp that they call a parrot clasp became pretty popular too. This patent was from 2002 in the US. But this one is very similar to the one we've seen more of in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which was most likely the design from Italy. So after researching for days on this, I understand it can be confusing because it certainly was for me. I will change my words a bit now to say that it has a lobster claw clasp. It is most likely a modern day piece. I have not seen too many of these pieces that are earlier that have the modern day clasp, but it is possible. You have to look at the piece as a whole. Look at the beads, the setting, the construction, the links, the patina, the style, and the clasp. They all have clues in them. Once you determine other features of the piece are vintage and it hasn't been restrung or reworked, then you might actually have a vintage piece with a lobster claw clasp. So let's take a look at some pieces and discuss the construction and see if we can figure out the age. Okay, I have a couple necklaces out here. We're going to quickly go through these and just try to make a quick determination if they're vintage or newer. There's differences in all of these. Like this one on the left here is a nicer shiny silver one, kind of has a retro style. It reminds me of vintage pieces. Let's take a closer look at it. Has some station beads. The silver's in good condition, but being in good condition doesn't necessarily mean that it's old or new, because new necklaces can have bad tarnish on them after 2 or 3 years. It just depends on the maker and how well it's made. So let's look at this pendant here. It's got some wear on the top, some rub marks, but you flip it over and it looks newer on the back. It says Monet with a copyright symbol, so we know it's after 1955. And that brushed stroke that's on the back here is newer looking. It looks fresher, cleaner, like machine brushed. Let's look at the clasp real quick. So we have the signature Monet clasp here. It says Monet on each side. So that wasn't invented until 1976. So we know this necklace is after 1976 and probably till about 2000. So it is a vintage piece if we're going by the 20-year mark. Next one, we look at these beads. These look like newer style beads. The frosted yellow and this pattern on these beads looks newer. The frosted rhinestones, the links, take a look at everything. The style looks newer, has a nice extender chain on it with a lobster claw clasp, and it says J. Crew. So we know that this one is newer. Look at that clasp. That is a signature 1996 clasp. So I would say it's definitely from the 2000s. Next, we have this lovely piece that looks vintage to me. It has the bar chain, which was used a lot in the vintage time frame. And it's lovely etched amber in bezel set. So after looking at it closer, it's an artisan piece. It was handmade. These were hand etched. Let's look at the back. Smooth setting. Let's look at the clasp. The clasp is a lobster claw clasp, but you can see how that is different than the J. Crew clasp. Now, an artisan piece could be anywhere, any time frame. An artisan piece is always hard to determine. They could use an old clasp on their pieces. They could be from another country when they made it, where the lobster claw clasp was popular previous to 2000. So let's look at them side by side here. Lobster claw clasp on the J. Crew, which try to get this out of the way, and the lobster claw clasp on the artisan piece. It is a little fatter, a little rounder. The teardrop one on the J. Crew is just slightly different shape, bigger, bulkier. They're slightly different. So this one, to me, is a vintage piece made in another country and artisan made. Next one, we have a beaded glass necklace that is pretty common. We see a lot of glass beaded necklaces. It has seed beads that go up it, which you don't normally see seed beads too much in vintage pieces. They're used a lot nowadays, but maybe not as much back in the 70s to 90s time frame. Let's look at the clasp, which it's hard to see. So here's the clasp. It's more of a newer clasp on it. You look at the beads. The beads could be Venetian. They're not Murano, but they could be Venetian because they have this like glitter inside. It's like glittered adventuring, which is like a copper. And it also has these little jump rings that are holding the three pieces together rather than a bar. In the older pieces, you'll see a bar across, like here. So that's a newer piece. I did throw this piece out just to show you. This is an older piece. It's a check glass beaded necklace. And see how the patina of the gold caps are a lot more aged. The links are aged. They're not shiny silver or gold anymore. It has a spring ring clasp. This is definitely an older piece. And you can distinguish that easily by all of the features it has. It has the vintage or antique look to it. It has gold caps. It has a gold antiqued patina to it. The links are all patinaed. And it has a spring ring clasp. And these red beads are very unique. So it's definitely easy to distinguish compared to something like this J. Crew. So, alright, that's all I have for you. I hope this video helped you. I hope it wasn't more confusing for you. I do believe that lobster claw clasps are more modern, and of course there are variations of that from the past, but you'll be able to tell by the whole piece as a whole whether or not it's vintage or new. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this video helped you. If it didn't, hit the dislike button. Thanks for joining me again. See you on the next one.